are coming in as a parachute, and the parachute will slow down the spacecraft. It doesn't slow it down enough to make it safe to land on the surface. Even at the terminal velocity, the slowest velocity that you can get to on the chute, it's still going too fast to let the rover land at those speeds. So we use a bridle system for Spirit Opportunity where they inflated these balloons, these big balloons around the rover, and then cut it off a bridle and let it fall encased in these balloons, and then it would just bounce. It would just bounce and bounce and bounce until eventually it would stop just from gravity. Once the rover detected it was stopped, it would puncture the balloons from the inside and then drive out. Now, this worked for Sojourner, Spirit, and Opportunity. It did not work for Curiosity. When they tried to wrap Curiosity in the balloons, Curiosity is so big, the size of a car, that as soon as they dropped it, the first impact on the ground, the balloons would puncture, and then the rover would feel the full weight of hitting the ground at those speeds. Over and over they tried and kept having the balloons puncture. So they created a new technology for Curiosity called the Sky Crane Maneuver, where they outfitted the rover on a rope until it touched down softly before the jetpack would fly off. This was the same mechanism that we were trying to use for Perseverance, but just like Curiosity had to invent a new technology of where we chose to go on Mars to get these samples. Now, scientists really like Jezero Crater because it looks very much like an ancient river going into a lake. You can see a channel here that formed that looks like a river that's emptying into this lake, where the edge of the lake basin is here, and then you see this nice delta of those deposits from the river kind of flowing out. And then there's a 300-meter cliff about here, and then a lower basin. This 300-meter cliff is very reminiscent. If you go to the beach and you go into the water, there's a shallow part, and then if you go far enough, there's a steep drop-off before it gets to the much deeper region. That's what this region is reminiscent, where this is the shallower part of that lake, and this is the deeper part of that lake. This white circle represents where Perseverance was going. That was the landing area of Perseverance. So the scientists were really excited. They're like, oh, we can get the deep part of the lake here. We can get the shallow part of the lake here. We can sample part of this cliff so we can actually get at the faces of it. And maybe over the course of the mission, we can actually drive up one of these channels and maybe even get to the river itself in the top of this lake. Scientists were very excited. There were many different types of samples that they could take here. Now, I'm an engineer by training, and so when I look at this picture, I see danger everywhere. The things that the scientists are excited about are usually the things that the engineers get very scared about. This bottom portion here, though it looks flat, is actually a very concentrated rock field. Anything from big boulders to small pebbles, many of the size that if the rover were to land on them, it would break a wheel or tip the rover off. Not a good area. The left-hand portion of this area is sand dunes, where if the rover were to land, it would have no traction that could never drive out of them. They're called inescapable regions. And then, not to mention the 300-meter cliff here, that if you were to land on the top of the cliff, the likelihood that you would fall down is very high, very unsafe for the rover. So, Perseverance had to develop new technology to land safely here, because it wasn't enough to use what Curiosity had. We would end up landing on one of the rocks or the cliff, and that would be mission over. So in order to do this, Perseverance added a new technology called terrain relative navigation, which is one of the parts of the mission that I worked on, that allowed us to see where we were coming as we were landing and pick a safe site to go to based on where we were coming down. Now, all of that is super important because entry, descent, and landing is probably one of those critical portions of the mission. It's not the only part of it, though. There are 4 different phases, where the first phase is launch. This is getting off of the Earth and getting into space. The second is the cruise phase, getting from Earth to Mars. And then the third is entry, descent, and landing, which I will talk a little bit more about in this presentation. And then finally, the last is the surface mission. This is the actual objective of the mission, to go around and collect science samples. Everything before that is just the delivery system, very complicated delivery system to get the rover to Mars. In 3 out of 4 of these phases, in launch, cruise, and surface, there's a lot of back and forth between the mission control here on Earth and the Perseverance rover, where Perseverance will say, oh, I did this, and then the mission control will look at the data and decide what to do next. That paradigm doesn't quite hold for entry, descent, and landing, which is why it makes it more challenging. So before I get into the details of the rover buttoned up into the whole Mars 2020 spacecraft, the right is the CAD exploded view, so you can actually see the different pieces. The rover itself is the only now this tiny thing here, and it's put into a larger launch vehicle fairing. So again, for a sense of scale, a person is about the size of just this little bit here, and then you get the whole spacecraft and then the launch vehicle itself. This whole fairing gets put on the tippy top of the rocket, is launched. This is a picture of our launch from Cape Canaveral. So the spacecraft is in this tiny portion up here, and the rest is all fuel to get it off the surface of the Earth. We launched on July 30th, 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic, but we had to go in July, otherwise we would have to wait another almost a little over 2 years, and because Mars and Earth are and we use this alignment of the planets to actually design our mission. So the Earth and Mars at the time of launch are very close. So it allows us to do what we call a direct trajectory, which is a type 1, meaning we go straight from Earth to Mars, and we only have to do a half loop around the solar system. Maneuvers 2 and 3, these are the maneuvers that actually target Mars. So you can see if you read the words, they kind of straddle the center of because after the 6.5 months, after 300 million miles, it only takes 7 minutes to get from the top of the Martian atmosphere to the ground. We jettison the cruise stage. So from Earth to Mars, the spacecraft is actually spinning. We spin the spacecraft at 2 revolutions per minute, and we use this gyroscopic stability to keep pointed in the right direction. Once we are at Mars, though, we don't need that stability, so we despin and jettison the cruise stage. The cruise stage goes off and crashes elsewhere on Mars, but now it's an entry capsule. And we actually had created the entry capsule so that it has a lift vector. And what that means is during Perseverance's entry into the atmosphere, it's not just coming in as a capsule, but it's actually coming in like an airplane in the Martian atmosphere. It has a lift vector, and it's actually maneuvering like a plane does to control its target, its distance to the target. So if it's coming in long, it will do a series of turns, just like a plane does as it's coming in for landing. This allows us to be able to have better accuracy of the landing performance. Once we get through the majority of the peak atmosphere, where we have the peak heating, where the heat shield is protecting us, and we go through the max acceleration, which can be up to 12 Gs. At this point, we're slow enough that we can deploy the supersonic parachute. Supersonic parachute gets deployed around Mach 2. It is the largest supersonic parachute that has ever been flown to date on Mars, and it slows down the vehicle from about Mach 2 to roughly about 80 to 100 meters per second at the time that we jettison the parachute. Once we're on the parachute, we can get rid of the heat shield. This is like a lens cap that's been covering the spacecraft being able to look at the ground. Once that heat shield is gone, we can actually see the ground, and we see it in 2 different ways. The first way is with the radar. This is like if you were to go into a room and you put your hands out. As soon as you touch the wall, you can tell when to stop so they don't hit yourself by running into the wall. That's what a radar gives you. It gives you distance to the target and how fast you're going. But it doesn't tell you where in the room you are. That's what we use the cameras for. So as part of the terrain relative navigation, the previous missions like Curiosity had the radar, but that's just enough to get you landing softly on the ground. It doesn't tell you where on Mars you're landing. For Perseverance, we needed to know where on Mars to land because some spots were worse than others. We didn't want to land on the cliff. We didn't want to land on the rocks. So we used a camera to take images while we were on the parachute. So as we're floating on the parachute, it's taking images, and then we compare it to a map to localize where we are. So by looking at the images and then correlating them to the map, we can triangulate where we are. And based on where we are, we have another map that gives a region of safe spots to land based on what we can get to. So Perseverance will actually pick the safest spot that it can get to based on where it currently is as it comes down in the parachute, and then how much fuel it has to see how far it can get. And this is the core of the terrain relative navigation that allowed us to land on Jezero Crater. Once we pick the safe site, we cut the back shell, release the parachute because we don't need it anymore, and then we do this divert maneuver to fly the spacecraft over to the safe spot and then hover, and then the spacecraft is lowered on bridles in order to land at that safe spot. So all of this happens from the top of the entry atmosphere. Everything on this slide happens in about 17 minutes. So the crew stage gets jettisoned about 10 minutes before entry interface, and everything else is in 7 minutes. So once it gets going really fast. And all that we can do in mission control is just wait and see it as it unfolds. So there were a couple of key technologies in addition to the terrain relative navigation that we use to improve our landing accuracy. I bring up one of them. This is a pretty cool one because it was just one line change of code where we decided how we were going to release the parachute, how we're going to deploy the parachute, and when. And based on that decision, we were able to improve our accuracy by over 40%. So in previous missions, Curiosity had just waited until they were slow enough. Once they got to Mach 2, which is 2 times the speed of sound, they deployed the parachute. Perseverance waited until they were slow enough and waited until they were at the right distance from the target to deploy the parachute. And by adding that range component, it allowed us to minimize the time on shoot, so we weren't pushed around by the winds as much, and that allowed us to shrink the landing area from these bigger circles of what Curiosity had to the smaller circles. So we got rid of having to worry about all of that area over there, which was instrumental in being able to land at Jezero Crater because we were able to constrain how much we were worried about in those regions. And then terrain relative navigation, this just gives a breakout of what the technology looked like. So it had a camera, which I mentioned, to take pictures of the terrain as we went down on the parachute. But the big part of the new technology was actually the new computer that we developed. The computer had an FPGA on it to be able to process the images.
Yes, which next is more hazardous than the one we go to. That's an interesting question. There's a balance for any particular landing. How hazardous is the surface, and how do we need to land at one specific spot? So it almost doesn't matter what everything else is. It takes that white circle that I had shown and collapses it into a very tiny circle, like the size of this podium, or within the size of this room, which is super helpful to the engineers because you can clear a design.
Also, you told the diffusion is done by the rover itself or the parachute.
The decisions, yeah.
The
the inflation. The inflation is a ignite the tripwire, and it uses dynamics to pull the parachute out. The decision of when to ignite that pyrotechnic is done on board by the rover itself. So the parachute is all folded and packed in, and then
has sent totally 3 rovers to the Mars. So I just 5 rovers in the past years. So what is the possibility of the humans to invade? You guys have found oxygen possibility, water and minerals, etc. So I just want to find out that is the possibility of humans to invade into Mars?
There's no contamination on any of our hardware that we send to Mars, because if we start bringing things from Earth to Mars to colonize, then our ability to say whether there was life there indigenous to Mars becomes corrupted. So, so far we've had very strict instructions to make sure we don't do organic material. To work on the Mars 2020 mission and at NASA in general, and part of what I loved about the Mars 2020 mission is that the team that I got to work on, especially for entry, descent, and landing, was a very diverse team. We had people from all over the world. We had people from India, from Indonesia, from Cambodia, from Argentina, all coming together and working. And that experience has shown me how powerful diversity in teams can be, so that when we're all working together, be it different nationalities or different ethnicities, or women and men working together, the diversity is important because of the different viewpoints of how people were raised, how they approach problems is different. So being an Indian American as part of this team, it helped me bring both aspects of that culture, and I see how my teammates from Argentina or from Japan brought both aspects of their culture and made for such a better team that I like to promote that, and that's part of why I've come to India as part of the speaker series.
We have launched more than 5 missions in Mars, rovers landed. What finding data will get?
So Perseverance was the 5th rover on Mars, and each rover mission has built on the scientific discoveries of the previous missions. So the first rover was just a demonstration to prove that we could actually